And Lionel, thank you. Someone just turned on, one of my co-hosts just turned on the recording. And Lionel Naccache, as I just said, is a leading researcher on the global workspace, and he is at the Sorbonne and at the Salpêtrière in Paris. And we're just looking forward to, you know what, I just realized literally we didn't quite decide who's going to go first between Mark and Lionel. So which one of you would like to go first? And if not, we're going to do it in alphabetical order. Is that okay? So Lionel, are you okay to go first?
Of course, I can go first, but if Mark prefers to begin with, I mean, it's absolutely,
fine.
Of course,
It's
no
fine.
problem.
It's fine with me. Thank you very much. I'll go second.
Okay, Lionel, so you have the floor. Feel free to share your screen if you wish.
Thank you very much. And again, so hi to everyone, and I'm really very happy to be part of this conference. And as Maggie said, I hope next year it will be a physical presence. So let me test my my split, my screen.
Great.
Sharing.
Yep.
Can you see my screen? Yes. Yes.
Yes.
So can you see it full screen? Yes, it's okay. Yes.
Yes, though right now we're seeing your presenter view. So
okay, sorry. So okay, so I will just exchange. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
So it should be this one, maybe this one. Is it better?
No, we're still seeing the presenter view.
Okay, so I tried last time. Otherwise, it's not that problematic. But maybe here. And here, is it better? No?
So at the moment, we're just seeing the actual PowerPoint format.
Lionel, if you click on the little present button there,
yes.
when you that, I think it will work.
Okay.
So position you were in before, and then push that. You all know the one that goes to presentation mode.
Okay, so because I have several ones open, so maybe I should. I think I have too much screens open. So let me. Sorry for.
No worries. Take your time.
So is it the correct one? Yes, so it should be okay. And, so is it something that you see? No. I don't know why, but so let me check again.
There we go. Voila.
Cool. Yes, thank you. Sorry for. So you do not count these 2 minutes, Maggie.
That's right.
No, I'm
I'll
joking.
starting the timer now.
So yes, once Mark and Maggie proposed me to have this session about consciousness, I propose to briefly introduce you because I don't know up to which point each of you is familiar with this global neuronal workspace theory of consciousness. So I would like just to take like 20 minutes to introduce you to the key ideas. So then our discussion with Mark and will be the more fruitful, I think. So the first thing I think to understand is that, of course, it's a neurobiological theory of consciousness. So you will, and I will present a lot of ideas with cortical networks, brain mechanisms, etc. But the key idea is that for me that you leave the session, so you see that this kind of hieroglyph. So I would like that in 20 minutes, this hieroglyph will turn to be fully clear to each of you, because actually this kind of representation, this schematic representation of the workspace, inspired by Marcel Mesulam, who is a great neurologist and neuropsychologist that you probably know. Actually, this schematic view only includes the key ideas, which are very basic, actually, but they have this visual representation. So the key idea, I think, for me, is that to understand that this theory, which is already kind of old, because this year in 2021, it's exactly 20 years after our first paper with Stanislas Dehaene about the first draft, the first kind of framework trying to propose this cognitive architecture, cognitive neuroscience of consciousness, inspired by the work of Bernard Bass, the American psychologist, cognitive psychologist, who first proposed a psychological version, a first version of this model. So it's already a long story. It stimulated the area, and of course, a lot of people do not agree with all ideas, and that's what is fun and interesting in science, of course, as you know. so we can try to correct, to change, to develop, to discuss, and to design experiments, and to have some clinical implications about these ideas. And for me, maybe the first key message of my talk would be to say that, of course, I will deal with brain, with neurological patients, etc. But this theory, if you really want to grasp its content, you have to see that the motivation of the theory comes from psychology. So I would say it's a theory which is really inspired, and more than inspired, it's driven, fully driven by some cognitive psychology description of consciousness. And I say that because you have other models, other theories, and some of them are really, their first source of evidence is really the brain or the neuronal mechanism, etc. But our theory is a psychological theory. So we really come from psychology in the way we try to design this model. And so we will try, and Bernard Bass proposed the first version, and we try to move with Jean-Pierre Changeux, Claire Sergent, Jérôme Sacure, other colleagues. We try to move from psychology to the brain about what is consciousness and how does it work in the brain. And of course, for consciousness, we need a definition to be clear with, not to use a very confused definition, or you know the polysemy of consciousness, of course. So we chose to use, and we are not the only one, of course, to define consciousness by this property, meaning that being conscious means being able to self-report. So being able to have a first person's perspective, if I may say. So being able to self-report some mental contents. Of course, in the case of perception, it will be much easier to test at bedside or in the lab, because you can control the stimulus which is presented to the subject. But of course, this reportability definition of consciousness is used for any possible mental conscious content. So it can be episodic memory, it can be feelings, desire, intentions, actions, volition, etc. Whatever. We will consider that being conscious means being able to self-report. And as you can imagine, we can spend hours and more than hours and years about defining exactly what we mean by self-reportability, just for very, very basic aspects. A paralyzed patient, like a patient in a locked-in syndrome patient, so patient who cannot communicate easily with external observers, when he's awake and able to self-report to himself some mental representation, according to this definition, he is completely conscious. So you don't have to confuse the self-report property we define here with the behaviors that you may use to communicate part of your self-reports to other people, including the observers or the physicians or whatever. So, and of course, if you want to discuss or to read the details of the reason why we stick to this definition, there is our first paper, the Cognition paper 2001, and a more recent one in Philosophical Transaction of the Royal Society, in which I try to develop why this definition seems to me really useful and working. So, of course, we begin with that, and we are here in the Neuropsicanálise Society, funded by Mark Solms, of course, which is for me, as you know, I was invited and I was very happy to participate in Paris a few years ago, and with Lisa Hous and with all the organizers. And I think it's a very strong commitment that you do, and which is also full of risks, and that's what maybe part of the discussion we can have with Mark. And just to say that, of course, when you deal with consciousness, and so also what is not conscious, so let's say unconscious cognitive processing or unconscious cognition or feelings or affects or whatever, you first have to be sure that you are clear about the definition. And what I think is nice is that when you even go back to Freud, of course, psychoanalysis does not resume to Freud, of course, but if you go back to Freud works and writings, even on this very famous introductory work trying to explain to the non-specialist what is psychoanalysis, etc. The way Freud defined consciousness is for me very useful, because if you read this definition from 1912, now let us call conscious a conception which is present to our consciousness, so like something on your conscious scene, if we may say, and of which we are aware. We are aware, so to be aware of something in English, of course, it's a transitive dimension of consciousness. And so being aware of something is very close to this self-reportability. This is something that you can reflexively report to yourself. So I think the starting point with Freud is very close to the one we use. So there is no problem at the beginning. So it's not like a confusion about the terms we are using. Of course, we can discuss about the theories developed by Freud. I will not address this point today for sake of the focus we try to discuss with Mark and with Maggie. But a few years ago, a long time ago, I wrote a book. It's partially translated in English, but if you read French, it's called The Nouvel Inconscient, The New Unconscious, in which basically I explain why I think that what is, for me at least, as a neurologist, interesting in Freudian work, it's not so much what he proposed and what he's defined about unconscious, but for me, Freud is interesting for the conscious aspects. So for consciousness, for conscious subjectivity, and for the narrative aspects, which are at the core mechanism of consciousness. I think he could grasp them like no one did before, but I disagree, I would say, on most of the other things about unconscious processing, but that's just a short digression. I will not develop today that. So if we go back to the theory of the workspace, so we begin by psychology. We selected this definition, self-reportability, being conscious, being self-reporting, okay, being. And of course, it means that you can deal, and here we enter really into the cognitive psychology of consciousness. And so what is interesting is that when you pay attention to the cognitive properties associated with cognitions or with processes that you are able to self-report, so conscious representations, if I may say this way, you can observe that there is a strong link between some properties and the fact of being conscious. So as if you could isolate some specific properties of consciousness beyond self-report, something that you observe mostly when people are able to self-report. And I list here just the basic one. I will not detail each of them, but for instance, the ability to explicitly keep in mind actively, like in working memory, the active, explicit, durable maintenance of information, it's something which is strikingly specific to conscious thoughts. And in many occasions, the other ones are very fleeting, the one you cannot report. They can be very complex, reaching high-level semantic processes, etc., but they seem to be very fleeting, very short-lived, if you want. Of course, a lot of cognitive flexibility, transfer to long-term episodic memory, strategic control. But I will focus here on this property, which is the key aspect of the model of Bernard Barthes and of our theory, that when you are conscious of a representation, if I may say it this way, it's like you are able to use this representation and to exert on this representation all your cognitive abilities. So you are able to use and to manipulate this conscious representation according to all your cognitive abilities. Let me take an illustration. If you are presented with a stimulus, let's say a word, not only can you access to the semantic level of representation of a word, which is already very complex, but that you can do it even when you are not able to self-report. But also, once you are conscious of a word, you can exert all the abilities, you can decide to translate it in another language, you can decide to recall an episodic memory about it, you can decide to sum the numerical value of each of its letters, you can do whatever you want, actually. You can keep it in mind for hours if you want to do that. So there is this notion, I think Bernard Barthes was the first really to put it this way, that once the representation is conscious, it becomes available for all your high-level cognitive abilities. And this idea is a key property of the workspace. And also what we did with Stanislas and with Jean-Pierre was just trying to propose, let's say, a neuronal equivalence to the psychological property, like an isomorphism between the psychological property of cognitive availability and a neural availability. And that's the key aspect of the workspace. So I will just...
Sorry,
yes.
Lionel.
Sorry, yes.
I have a challenging request for you, since you have a short time period to present. But if you could speak a little slower, people are having a hard time understanding.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Can you tell me, please, Maggie, how long do I have?
Now, you have, sorry, I think about 20, you have about 18 minutes left.
Okay, so I will go down. I will go more slowly, but I don't have to come back to the beginning, no?
No, that's fine, because
okay.
we're recording the session for anybody who needs, they can hear it again.
Of course, thank you. So, of course, once you introduce this theory this way, you have two big questions that you can ask. These one are not the exclusive question, but these two questions are first a question about the conscious state. So what do you need in your brain, if I may put it this way? What do you need to be in a conscious state? So what do you need in your brain to be able to self-report? Whatever the content of your consciousness is. So we call this dimension of the problem the intransitive aspect. So here we do not focus on the mechanisms which are subtending the fact that you will access a specific conscious content, but just on the intransitive question, what do you have to get a workspace working in your brain, in your mind? And the second question is a more specific question about how do you explain that at a given moment, a conscious individual, so an individual able to self-report, some mental states, mental representation, what happened in your brain when you are accessing a specific content, a visual representation, an auditory representation. So these one are the two key questions, and they are not independent, of course, but you don't have to confuse them in order to keep the clarity of the vocabulary that we are using. So let me now illustrate it even more precisely. So in psychology, these ideas have also been developed the following way. In particular, I think to Jerry Fodor, who was a great psychologist. And of course, I think all of you, or most of you, are familiar with his short book, Modularity of Mind, in the 80s. So, and basically, Jerry Fodor noticed that a lot of unconscious cognition seems to respond to modularity property. And what is modularity is a list of properties, like something which is modular on a cognitive point of view. It's something that is completely encapsulated. So it's really isolated from other cognitive modules. So it's within a module. It's proceeding very fast. It's automatic. You cannot prevent and exert cognitive control over it. It's completely unconscious. You cannot self-report it, etc. And all these modular properties seem for Fodor, and also in the logic of Bars, explain a lot of unconscious cognition. But at the same time, a little bit like the idea of cognitive availability that I introduced briefly, Fodor and others notice that once you are conscious of something, you break the modularity of your mind. So, and we go back to this idea that once you are conscious of a representation, this representation becomes available for all your other cognitive abilities. And we try to propose exactly, let's say, the basic brain foundations of these two modes of two kind of organization in your brain, in the processing of information, the unconscious, rather modular, and I will come back to that, and the non-modular conscious dimension. So I will illustrate it just by a short experiment. I flash a word on the screen, like here, you see a word for like one or two screen presentations. So you will have like a few tens of milliseconds, a word being flashed on the screen, but I can use visual masks to sandwich the word temporally. So before and after the word, you will have visual masks, so stimuli looking like a little bit like letters, but which are not letters, for instance. And in which case, if you work well, you can flash this word on the retina of the subject, but the subject will not be able to self-report the word. So he will not be conscious of the word according to this definition. And still, using a lot of psychological priming paradigms, or a lot of implicit cognition paradigm, etc., you can demonstrate actually that in many cases, this word that escaped conscious access was still processed at a rather high level in your mind and in your brain. And for instance, we could observe like a semantic activation in your brain, in your mind, and the corresponding activation in your brain. And so with our colleagues, we could in particular, we were the first to demonstrate that when you flash a word on the retina of an adult reader of this language, you can activate not only V1, the primary visual cortex, but you can even activate the left fusiform gyrus in an area that we defined before as a visual word form area, and even some semantic representation in other networks. So you can have this equivalence of, let's say, the modular unconscious processing of the words in your brain. And at the same time, if you remove the mask, so if the word is still flashed for 29 milliseconds, but this time it it can be consciously accessed because the masks are not presented. So the stimulus is not mask, is not subliminal. You can still, so what is interesting is that the word was presented for the same duration, but still in one case, it escaped conscious access, while in the other one, you could consciously process it. And what we could observe is that in this case, you don't have only the modular, let's say, activation of your less fusiform gyrus, but you have the co-activation of a brain scale network, including frontal, parietal areas, anterior cingulate, etc. And so this image for us, it's like an illustration, if I compare the two, of the unconscious, fast, modular, and encapsulated activation as compared to a more diffuse brain scale, non-modular activation corresponding to conscious cognition. So to go back to the psychological ideas I try to introduce. And with Raphaël Gaillard and with Imen El-Karoui, with other colleagues, we tried and we could dissect in time. So because these data are fMRI, so as you know, fMRI is interesting, but it's a temporally very poor method at the, let's say, the second range level of description of the dynamics of what happened in your brain. So we could do the same thing with electrodes implanted in the brain of epileptic patients, like Nikolai is doing also, will maybe present later on today. And what we did, I just show you one result. We could demonstrate, for instance, that when you pay attention to the dynamics in your brain, when you process the word unconsciously, so you have transient early activation in these specific networks related to reading, like the left fusiform gyrus. But when you compute functional connectivity measures between distant electrodes, you cannot really see. 0 is the time the word was presented on the screen. You don't see any really increase of functional connectivity for long distance within the different areas of the brain of the patients. So as if you are just a ballistic, very localized, so very modular activation. Whereas when you are conscious, you have a first, let's say, stage of processing, which seem to be non-conscious during the first 100 milliseconds. And then you have this massive increase of connectivity, this breaking of modularity in your brain, which is the equivalence of the breaking of modularity in your mind that you can describe according to the psychological properties I listed before. So once I said that, you can begin to have this schema. So we recycle the mesulam representation from a great paper in brain, from sensation to perception. So mesulam proposed to describe the cortex as a set of concentric circles. The most external circle correspond to cortical networks, cortical regions, which are in direct contact with the external world. Or let's say all the primary cortices, primary motor cortex, primary visual cortex, auditory, etc., blah, blah. And the second cortex is already much more inner cortices, like secondary areas, if you want. And the more you go inside, the more you go to the associative cortices, high-level associative cortices. And so when you describe the cortex this way, you have the hierarchy of connectivity according to the external to internal, or to relation to the external world, to more associative cortices. So I'm not too fast, but I really want to go to the end because I have a clinical case to present you and to discuss with you. So each of these circles is not one neuron, but it could be a modular, or let's say a processor, a cortical processor specialized for a given area. And what we propose is that in your brain, at any moment, you have a lot of processors which are processing information unconsciously in parallel, a little bit according to the modularity I proposed before, this notion of encapsulation of automatic processing, which is out of your ability to self-report. You are not conscious of that. So you can imagine your brain being really hosted by a lot of diversity of unconscious processes which are operating in parallel. And the key idea of the model is that at the most inner part, in the most higher associative cortices, like prefrontal, parietal, but other lobes, of course, you would have another network. And this one is a global network, the global neuronal workspace. And this one would have two properties. First, because it's high-level hierarchy, it can communicate and it can access external representation located outside in the peripheral system. So meaning that there is not a rigid limit of your conscious content. According to the time moment, you can access a given network which is located outside. So it's really important. There is no one area for consciousness in the brain for this model. And the second most important property is that you can see here schematically that the principal components of this network are massively intraconnected. So you can see here you have a massive intraconnectivity that you can oppose to the parallelism which is applying for the peripheral system. And very basically, the properties that we infer is that if you have this network with massive intraconnectivity, it has one consequence, very basic, is that this network, the global one, can host only one representation at a time, serially. So meaning that according to this model, you would explain this very old-known fact that you are conscious of only one thing at a time. And if I show you, for instance, that, of course, that you are very aware of course, in the rabbit duck gastro stimulus, you know that you can perceive the two, but at one time you can consciously perceive only one of them. You alternate. And this would be just a translation that the neural basis for that would be this massive intraconnectivity of your workspace that you can oppose to the parallel distribution of the peripheral space, in which you could have both perception being unconsciously processed in parallel, if I may say. Okay. So I go fast because I would like to go to other points. I will not discuss. We propose, of course, the mechanism we describe, according to which you can access to a representation which is located in a specialized peripheral network, like a word or a face or whatever. And I can go back to that later on when we will discuss with Mark if it's necessary. But a key point is that in perception, and I would say that all cognition would maybe be also affected by this property, that the brain activation when you read one word in healthy subjects, you have a first part of the movie which is like 200 milliseconds, and which correspond to like posterior to anterior activation of the brain. But if you pay attention to the posterior areas, you have a late reactivation of these posterior areas, and this late activation would correspond to the conscious access. So we postulate that you have two stages of perception. The first is always non-conscious, and the second happens or not. And when it happens, it would correspond to this conscious access to the workspace. So I will close now to say that we could measure in patients, a lot of patients, vegetative state patients, minimally conscious state patients, but also in neglect patients, a lot of patients, to test these ideas about connectivity, long-distance connectivity. I will not develop that because I want to describe the clinical case. We could also do that with other colleagues in many neurological conditions. And in particular, we could demonstrate that when you have epileptic seizures, focal seizures in which at the beginning, the patient is still conscious according to this definition, you can try to see at what point the patient is losing consciousness when the seizure propagates. And what we could demonstrate is that you lose consciousness when this seizure that began in a specialized network is accessing your frontoparietal network. So as a way of saying that you can lose consciousness either because you don't have a workspace working, or because your workspace is too much connected, if I may say so, I can develop. So I will turn for the last idea here.
Yeah, thank you. Lionel, you have 5 minutes.
Yes, so that's enough. Thank you, Maggie. So the last idea, and I think for me, it's one of the key properties, and even in my book, it's one of the key things for clinical application that I think is really important. And for neuropsychoanalysts, it can be really interesting to discuss that. The idea we will not develop. I will not detail this slide, but the idea is that, of course, that you can have conscious processes, unconscious processes influencing your conscious content, etc. But what interesting me a lot also is the reverse mechanism, meaning that when you are in a conscious posture, if I may say, you will have influences on many of your non-conscious processing. So to say, the radical version of modularity, according to which unconscious is always out of cognitive control, I think it is not correct. You have a lot of situations in which actually the posture that you adopt consciously will influence, even if you are not aware of that, a lot of unconscious processes, and you will see consciously the consequences, like an indirect stage. So you have conscious influence on something that you don't know, and so you will then access to something which was modified by the consequences of your conscious posture, even if you are not the conscious agent of this phenomenon. And in clinics, I think it can be really important for, of course, a large field of functional neurological disorders, of conversive disorders, or how do you want to call them, but which are really a massive situation. Up to 20% of neurological emergencies end up with this kind of diagnosis. So we deal with something very frequent and very complex to address. And I will close with a case. We try with a colleague, a physician, clinical physician working on hypnosis, trying to induce deafness in a patient. I will not detail why we did that, but we are using auditory cognition. We have a test in which we stimulate subject with deviant or standard stimuli. So standard sounds or deviant sounds, a little bit like the oddball paradigm. We call that the local global paradigm. And the point I want to illustrate with this case, so we are working on it with Esteban Munoz Musa, who is a PhD student working with me. So actually we had this young woman who was suggestible. She could participate, volunteer to this study a few years ago. And we could record the EEG when she was stimulated with the beeps, with the sound, deviant or standard, before the induction and during and after the induction and after the cessation, the end of the suggestion, of course. So we had 3 sessions. I present you the first 2 sessions. So what we can see is that I will try to just to set up the main result. When you are stimulated with the sound, you have a first level of auditory cortical activation called the P1 component. And what we could see is that actually, and so this one would belong to the first stage of processing of the stimuli, the first stage, which is not conscious actually. And so we could record the P1 for each of the sounds being stimulated. And the P1 was identical for the pre-hypnosis session of recording and during the hypnosis. So the P1 was not affected by the induction of deafness for the patient. But at the end, the latest component of the EAPs is what we call the P3B. And according to our model, it's really it would be, and we can discuss that, the signature of the entrance of the representation into your workspace. And absolutely, it was fantastic for us when the patient, she's not a patient, when the subject, the individual, reported with a verb motor code that she could not hear anymore the sound, it was true that there was no P3B. So we could not record, so during the hypnosis session, there was no P3B, as if the signature, the proposed signature of entrance to the workspace was not present. She was consciously deaf, okay? But the first auditory cortex activation was identical, unaffected by the solution of this hypnotic suggestion. And in the middle, we could discover 2 things: the mismatch negativity, which is the first unconscious analysis of auditory novelty, which was absolutely the same before hypnosis and during hypnosis. But we had only for the hypnotic stage a prefrontal activation, a P3A, that was originating from the anterior cingulate cortex, which plays a massive role in inhibition or executive control. And we could observe actually that this anterior cingulate estimated source from the EEG, from high-density EEG, was present here only during the hypnotic session. So the minimal scenario we propose, we cannot demonstrate it. It's just a proof of concept that we can use this method in this kind of situation, is that the first stage of activation was not affected by the hypnotic induction. But one way or the other, the subject could find a way consciously to have this kind of inhibition mediated by the anterior cingulate, preventing the representation to access the workspace. And in the end, she was deaf. And of course, when we could end with Jean-Marc Benayem, the hypnotic session, she could return to a normal stage, of course. So for me, it's really an illustration in the clinical situation. And we could move from suggestion to functional neurological disorders, in which you could have like some conscious sources of the consequences of which the subject is not aware and is not the agent, the voluntary agent, but could have a conscious origin in this complex interplay between conscious and unconscious cognition. So I hope I was not too long, not too fast, and I hope it was at least some bit of information could be communicated also with my French accent on a Saturday afternoon, but we'll see. But that I propose to pick up some of these ideas to introduce to this model and to see some implication for the subject which are gathering us together today. Yes.
C'est très magnifique.
Ah,
So,
merci, Maggie.
Lionel, if you can stop sharing your screen.
Of
and
course,
then,
yes.
Then when you see, because I want you to be able to see the visual applause. So
Yes.
I'm the designated applauder.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that great talk. Now, it was fast, so we will have the recording, and I'm sure that many people who have not yet encountered this information, you'll be motivated to read Lionel's papers, and also Stanislas Dehaene has a wonderful book on consciousness that summarizes some of what Lionel was presenting. So we're just going to switch now directly to Mark Solms. So Mark, you'll give your talk, and then you and Lionel will have a dialogue. But thank you.
Thanks very much, Lionel. Thank you, Maggie. In view of the shortness of time, I better start speaking. Here's my title. I want to just make clear that what I'm doing now is presenting my own view, not responding to Lionel's view. We'll have a discussion where we will respond to each other. So this is a sort of different perspective. Although I do want to say that I am very admiring of the neuronal global workspace theory. I do not think what I'm going to say is incompatible with it. I think it provides a sort of a subcortical underbelly or foundation to the theory. It is the most impressive of all of the cortical theories for neurologists and neuropsychologists. The neuronal global workspace theory is the most compelling and most convincing of all the other games in town. So what I'm presenting is a different view, but not a contradictory view. I think it's complementary. So I will dive straight in. My starting point is David Chalmers's hard problem of consciousness, in which he says that the easy problems are easy because they concern cognitive abilities and functions, and you can easily identify the mechanisms that underpin these cognitive functions. That this is what cognitive neuroscience is very good at. But the problem is that even after you've specified the function, there's a question that remains unanswered. He says, why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? A simple explanation of the functions leaves this question open. Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? In other words, why don't the sorts of things that Lionel has just outlined for us, why can't global availability and sustainability and non-modularity and all or none ignition, etc., why do these things require consciousness? The very same mechanisms could happen without consciousness. This is what Chalmers says. And you know, there's the famous knowledge argument that this viewpoint has recourse to. That they speak of Mary, the visual neuroscientist, to simplify, who I say she was blind. She was born blind. And she knows everything there is to know about the functional mechanisms of vision, but she has never actually had the experience of seeing. And what Frank Jackson, who coined this argument, points out is that even though she knows everything about the functional mechanisms of vision, if one day, thanks God, she suddenly has the gift of sight bestowed upon her, she will learn something utterly new about vision. What it is like to experience red, blue, green, etc., her theory would never have predicted. Her knowledge of the mechanisms, the functional mechanisms, would never have prepared her for or even predicted that there is this thing, something it is like to experience visual qualities. So they suggest that these mechanistic functional accounts that cognitive neuroscience is so good at doesn't actually explain experience. And this is very worrying because it implies that experience somehow exists outside of natural science, of our normal way of giving mechanistic explanations for things. So here's the hard problem, as stated in the quotation I've just showed you on the screen, a la Chalmers. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? According to the knowledge argument, it appears it can go on in the dark without any inner field. The mechanism doesn't require any inner field. Another way of stating that more simply is, where is the experiencing subject of the brain's information processing? There's all this information processing going on, but where in all of this information processing is there a subject experiencing it? So I'm going to address this question, a very simple question, in a very simple way. I'm going to use some case studies. That's always the easiest way to do so. The standard answer as to where the experiencing subject is in the prefrontal cortex. There are all these modular, by the way, this is not a response to the global workspace theory. The global workspace theory goes beyond this. Okay, it doesn't only claim that the prefrontal cortex. I'm just saying that the most common view is, where is the subject in the cortex that experiences all this information processing? There are 2 or 3 common views. The most common one is prefrontal cortex. So I want to show you what happens in a patient of mine who had absolutely no prefrontal cortex. I won't go into all the details of the pathology. I can do so later if necessary. I just want to show you what happened when I had a conversation with this patient. I asked him if he was consciously aware of his thoughts. He said he was. I said, well, I need to be able to demonstrate that to my colleagues. So I asked him to picture something in his mind's eye, and he agreed to do that. I asked him to picture 2 dogs and 1 chicken. And once he'd done that, he said, yes, he's now picturing 2 dogs and 1 chicken. I said to him, now tell me, how many legs do you see in total? And to my great disappointment, his answer was 8. 2 dogs and 1 chicken. And I said, 8? And he said, yes, the dogs ate the chicken. It's not the best joke in the world, but I think you will agree that there's a subject there. This is evidence that there is somebody at home who's looking at the dogs and the chicken and who's making a joke to me. So the most widely used answer to the question as to, well, where is the subject of all this information processing seems not to be in the prefrontal cortex. Another view is that it's in the anterior cingular gyrus. I won't go into that. There are many, many patients with bilateral anterior cingular gyrus lesions who are clearly conscious.
Uh-oh, appears like we might have lost Mark. No? I see that his camera's off.
Yes,
Mark,
he's
are you
gone.
there? Okay, he might have to, I think he might have
I'm
kind of,
back, Maggie. I don't know what happened.
okay, good.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm not sure what happened. I'm going to go back to my, can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, I'm not sure what happened there.
Okay, now we can see your slides and you.
Yeah, I'm going to have to do this because I know from experience that okay. Sorry, I don't know where I lost you. Did I say something about the anterior cingular gyrus?
I believe so. I think
Okay.
that we only just lost you for 30 seconds.
Okay. Well, I'll skip over the anterior cingular gyrus and say that the third sort of favorite site for the sentient subject of the mind is the one that that Bud Craig championed, namely the the insula. And I'll just quickly show you an interview that Antonio Damasio did with this patient who had absolutely no insula. Again, I won't go into the pathological details, but like my patient in relation to the prefrontal lobes, this patient had absolutely no insula. There's a long discussion here, which I won't go into. The bottom line, I think, says it all. Damasio says, what if I were to tell you that you're aware that I'm aware? And the patient says, I would say you're right. Damasio said, you're aware that I'm aware. The patient says, I'm aware that you're aware that I'm aware. So again, a little bit of a joke there. The patient is clearly, there's somebody at home, there's somebody reporting to use Lionel's definition of consciousness. There's this person giving a self-report of his inner experience. So these patients, the one who has no prefrontal cortex, the other who has no insula, clearly there's still a sentient subject. But of course, in these patients, there's plenty of cortex that remains intact. So one might say, well, you know, the other cortex is taking up the slack. So what happens in a patient where the cortex in its entirety is absent? And the most common situation in which this occurs is this condition known as hydranencephaly, where the patient is born without any cortex. Here is one such patient. And as you can see, she's conscious in the sense that she wakes up in the morning and goes to sleep at night. But much more interestingly, you see she responds emotionally to the experience of her baby brother being placed on her lap. She goes, oh, she likes it. So this patient with absolutely no cortex, there's behavioral evidence of conscious being, of a sentient subject, in the sense of an affectively responsive person. Here's another such child, just to show that that's not a rarity. You know, many of these patients show these features, which I'm showing on the screen. Here's Bjorn Merker's summary of his observations of many of these children. Again, I'm not going to read you the whole slide. The important thing is that they show pleasure and smiling and laughter and aversion and fussing, giggling. They show preferences. They even show initiative. And the most important thing is that they show this range of basic emotional responsivity in situationally appropriate ways. In other words, the emotion that they display is the one that you would expect given the kind of situation that they're in. You clap your hands and give them a fright, they show surprise. You tickle them, they giggle. You frustrate them, they arch their back and cry, and so on. So these are, this is weighty evidence for the view that not only is the sentient subject not locatable in the prefrontal cortex, nor in the insular cortex, but in fact, not in the cortex at all. And this is the main point that I'm wanting to make. I think that it's questionable in terms of the question I asked at the outset, where is the experiencing subject of this information processing? I think that it's questionable whether the experiencing subject of the mind is cortical at all. And I'm using this evidence, the most compelling evidence, that in children with no cortex at all, and the same applies to decorticate mammals, you see a wide range of conscious experience of the kind that we call affective. In other words, emotional responsivity. Now, of course, it's hard to know. What these children are experiencing. We can't rely on only one line of evidence, namely their behavior. So I'm going to return to that in a moment, but I just want to state the conclusion I've come to so far, namely that the experiencing subject is literally constituted by affect. If we accept so far that there seems to be an experiencing subject, an affectively experiencing subject in the case of these children with absolutely no cortex. It's also interesting in this connection that the two patients who I reported earlier, namely the patient with no insula and the patient with no prefrontal cortex, these patients both showed full affectivity. In fact, they were both somewhat disinhibited in respect of their affect. They were more affect than you would normally expect. And this is also commonly what we observe with massive insula and massive prefrontal cortical lesions. Now, I want to say something, remind us all of something, which in fact we all know, which is that it is quite remarkable that many higher cognitive functions of the kind that the cortex performs, in fact, most of the higher cognitive functions of the kind that the cortex performs, it can do without consciousness. For example, reading with comprehension, a exclusively cortical function, a uniquely human cortical function, can be performed without any consciousness at all. So this brings us back to the question as to why we're looking to cortex in order to address this hard problem of what is the functional mechanism of consciousness. If the functional mechanisms that are instantiated by cortical information processing can carry on in the dark, as it were, can, for the most part, take place without consciousness, then perhaps it's the wrong place for us to be looking. Perhaps we should be looking to these brainstem structures, which are preserved in these kids with no cortex at all. And those brainstem structures, the type of consciousness, as I showed you, that is generated by these kids is an affective type of consciousness, not a cognitive type. So here's a statement that many psychoanalysts find surprising. Sigmund Freud, of all people, the discoverer of the unconscious, as the title of Lionel's book makes plain, the discoverer of the unconscious, Freud said that the property of being unconscious can not be applied to one class of mental functions, and that is affects, feelings. Who ever heard of a feeling that you don't feel? So it seems as if this is the place we should be looking. If we're wanting to find, unlike in Jackson's visual neuroscientist Mary, whose understanding of the mechanism of vision didn't give her any experience, any preparedness for what it is like to see, perhaps the mechanism of affect is a better place for us to look, because how can you have an affective experience without experiencing it? How can you have a feeling without feeling it? And this is not just a semantic point. As I've said, the patients that I showed you who have no cortex at all, the kind of consciousness that they do seem to have, even though they have only a brain stem, is affective consciousness. Now we need to add to that something we've long known, which is that if you make very small lesions in the brainstem, especially in the upper brainstem, where these so-called reticular activating nuclei are situated, you can have a lesion as small as 2 cubic millimeters in the parabrachial region, for example, and this obliterates all cortical consciousness. So just look at the contrast that I've just made for you. I've showed you that patients with absolutely no cortex appear to remain conscious. Absolutely no cortex, the whole cortical expanse is missing. And these patients appear to remain conscious affectively. And conversely, tiny lesions of the brainstem obliterate all consciousness, not only affective, but cognitive too. So what this suggests, what we've long known, is that cognitive consciousness, cortical consciousness, is contingent upon brainstem arousal. What's been added is the observation, which I think is of profound importance, that brainstem arousal is not just a power supply. It's not just some volume control switch. There is a quality and a content to the brainstem arousal type of consciousness that we call wakefulness. And that quality and content is affect. It feels like something to be a hydranencephalic child, is the claim that I'm making. And why that's so important is because it's generally accepted that brainstem arousal is a prerequisite for cortical cognitive consciousness. What that implies is that affect is a prerequisite. And I think that's terribly important. Now, it's not enough, as I said earlier, just to look at these children's behavior and take that as sufficient evidence for the conclusion that they are, in fact, conscious sentient subjects. We need to use other methods too, because those children can't give us the self-report that, as Lionel said, is generally considered definitional of the sort of empirical criterion of consciousness is self-report. Those children can't provide self-reports, so we can't be sure that they are in fact experiencing affect, and that affect is therefore the kind of consciousness that the brainstem produces. So let's have a look at a couple of other lines of evidence. If you stimulate these upper brainstem structures that constitute the reticular activating system, you generate intense affective states. So this is a second line of evidence suggesting that these structures actually generate affect. These patients have intact cortex, so they can report what happens if you stimulate the upper brainstem structures in question. And here, again, I'm not going to read this whole quote. This is a well-known case. This is a patient with Parkinson's disease where deep brain stimulation was the electrode went a little deeper than expected into the substantia nigra, part of the reticular activating system. And within 5 seconds, as Blomstedt reported, she fell into a suicidal depression. And as soon as the stimulus was switched off, 30 seconds later, the depression stopped. And reliably after that, every time the electrode was switched on again in the reticular activating nucleus in question, again, this profound suicidal depression was generated. So this suggests that affect is actually produced by these structures. Here's another line of evidence, namely positron emission tomography. These are experimental subjects in strong basic emotional states, and regardless of what emotion we're talking about, what you see is that the activation is in subcortical structures, principally in brainstem structures, and that in contrast to this activation in these subcortical structures, the cortex is actually deactivated. So this is further evidence that that affects are actually generated by activity in the upper brainstem. The last line of evidence is the most sort of obvious, and yet the one that we have overlooked, namely that the neuromodulators, the source cells of which are in the reticular activating system, like dopamine and serotonin and noradrenaline, which are the chemical systems that are targeted by mainstream psychiatric drugs. Antidepressants, for example, increase availability of serotonin. Antipsychotics block the availability of dopamine. Anti-anxiety drugs, likewise with noradrenaline. These substances that psychiatrists tinker with, they are neuromodulatory substances, the source cells of which are in the reticular activating system. So if this was just a power supply, kind of volume control, then it would only interest anesthetists. And yet psychiatrists, doctors for feelings, the neurotransmitter systems that they target are the neuromodulatory systems arising from the reticular activating system. So combining all of these different lines of evidence, it seems as if the basic form of consciousness is this brainstem form of consciousness, and that its quality is affective. And now we can go back to Chalmers. Chalmers says all of these things, and then he says at the end, there's no cognitive function. This is just a repetition of what he said in the quotation I showed you earlier. He said, there's no cognitive function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. So that's what he was saying earlier, this thing about these functions. You can explain the function, but it won't explain why there is something it is like to be the subject of that function. And I think it all has to do, what he's saying here, has to do with this word cognitive function. If you replace that with the word affective function, it doesn't, it's the argument no longer appears so compelling. Could Chalmers say there is no affective function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience? I mean, if you have an explanation of feeling, surely it will say in advance why you feel it. So this brings me full circle back to where I began. I think that we've been looking in the wrong place in terms of not the whole of consciousness, in terms of the essential feature of consciousness, the one that has brought the hard problem upon our heads. Why can't we give a functional mechanistic account of consciousness? It's because we've been looking at its cognitive forms, which are derivative forms, its cortical forms, which are secondary forms. Very, very important. I'm very glad to have cortex. I wouldn't like to do without it, but it appears that the cortex can do most of what it does without consciousness, and that its consciousness is supplied by upper brainstem arousal structures. And therefore, if we're wanting to get to the essential foundational mechanism of consciousness, we should be looking to the brainstem and to affect. Because, as I've said, affect, unlike cognition, these structures are for consciousness, not for information processing. They're for feeling our way into the information processing. So I think that's where we should be looking. So what is the functional mechanism of affect? Here we have a well-developed theory initiated by Jaak Panksepp, popularized by Antonio Damasio, namely that affect is homeostatic. Homeostasis is the basic function of living things. We living things differ from other things in the physical universe in that we oppose entropy. We don't just dissipate and equalize with our environments. We work to remain within specific negentropic bounds in regard to various physiological parameters underlying bodily needs like thermoregulation and respiratory control and blood gas balance and so on. But also emotions work in the same way. We have to stay within certain viable bounds. We have to not be under attack. We have to not be frustrated by impeding obstacles. We have to not have our caregivers wandering off and abandoning us. If they do, then we feel an unpleasant feeling. And the basic theory on offer here is that although homeostasis can function autonomically, automatically, mechanistically, the advantage of being able to feel how you're doing is that when you're in an unpredictable situation for which there isn't a pre-established prediction, a predictive algorithm of the kind that we are born with, which we call reflexes and instincts, if you find yourself in an unpredicted situation and you need to re-establish homeostasis and you don't have a pre-prepared prediction as to what to do, then the feeling your way through the problem, knowing whether what you're doing is making matters worse or making matters better, according to this theory, that's what consciousness is for. Feeling tells you whether you're doing the wrong thing or the right thing in an uncertain situation. Therefore, feeling enables choice. It enables you to make a choice which underwrites voluntary action. This is no small advantage, to be able to feel your way through a problem and decide what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong, in terms of the basic value system of living organisms, namely that it is good to survive and bad not to. So feelings of unpleasure indicate you're moving out of your viable survival bounds, and pleasurable feelings indicate you're heading back towards your viable survival bounds. And so these feelings provide value for the subject of the mind. The organism knows its own state, whether it's doing badly or it's doing well, in terms of whether what it's doing feels bad or feels good. And
Mark,
so this...
sorry,
yeah?
you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you. So this suggests a functional mechanism for feeling, a causal contribution to the organism, for the organism. And as I've said repeatedly through this brief talk, this function cannot go on unconsciously. The whole point of the function is to make the organism feel in this way that is of such existential consequentiality. The valence, the value of what it's doing within a particular category of need. In other words, within a particular category of homeostatic regulation, so that these different feelings of goodness and badness are necessarily qualified feelings, so that hunger feels different from thirst, feels different from sleepiness, feels different from fear, feels different from rage, and so on. So this seems to be the basic function of consciousness. And remember, I'm not saying it's the whole function of consciousness. I'm saying it's the most primitive, foundational one, which seems to be seems to be a prerequisite, a necessary condition for cortical cognitive consciousness. Now, there's a long story that I could go into, but which I don't have time to go into, which I've outlined in this paper with Carl Friston, as to how this mechanism that I've just, well, first of all, to show that the mechanism that I've just summarized, that it is possible to reduce it to an ordinary causal mechanistic account. It's possible to reduce it to a lawful operation. How feeling works in this most basic way, an extended form of homeostasis. So, unlike what Chalmers said, the idea that a functional mechanistic account of consciousness doesn't account for why there is something it is like to be conscious. I'm saying that doesn't apply in the case of affect. But I've also said, and I will end with this, that this is not an account of the whole of consciousness. Remember, I'm saying that this provides an underbelly, a sort of a foundation for the cortical form of consciousness that Lionel and his colleagues have elaborated so persuasively in the neuronal global network theory. In this model, what the brainstem arousal structures provide is what in computational neuroscience is called precision. Precision just is postsynaptic gain. It just is arousal. It's the same thing. But the function that it performs is it mediates uncertainty, so that the more certain, the more confident we are in our predictions. This is the cognitive aspect within our theory, the theory that a framework within which I'm working with Carl Friston and his colleagues, is that cognition is all about predicting what must I do in order to meet my needs. And if what I do has the sensory consequences that are expected, that's good, then we can have high confidence in our predictions. In other words, we can afford them high precision. If, however, we do not have the sensory outcomes we expect, and there are errors, then we need to use those errors to update our predictions. And so the modulation of precision, if things are working out as expected, we have high confidence in the predictions, that's good. If uncertainty prevails, we have high confidence in the error signals, which means low confidence in our predictions, that's bad. So this cognitive goodness and badness, things are turning out as expected or not, is mediated by the feelings that I spoke of in relation to feeling homeostasis. So feelings regulate this process of cognitive judgment. That's a very, very brief sketch. Of course, you can't do justice to the whole story in such a short presentation, but I do think that it takes us some way toward addressing this fundamental question. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner feel? But I'm also very much aware that all I've done is give you a clue. So I'm hoping that I also will entice you to read my book in where I explain all of this in much more detail. Thanks very much, Maggie. Thanks, Lionel.
Thank you, Mark. Great. So you can see everyone applauding. Thank you so much, Mark. That was great, very succinct. And as you just said, I mean, I'm asking Ross to post in the link Lionel's Wikipedia page for people who want to follow up on his readings. And of course, Mark's book is going to be quite an elaboration of some of the basic things that Mark just said today. So again, now I want to really invite Lionel and Mark to have a dialogue with each other. As I said before, don't worry about us. Actually, a lot of people on the call already know something about Mark's model. A fair number of us on the call are familiar with either the basics of the global neuronal workspace theory or followed the essence of what you said. So I think it will be really interesting for us to hear like the real questions that you guys have for each other. And so we'll start that in just a second. And during this time, the participants are also welcome to put questions and comments in the chat. So we're going to give Lionel and Mark 30 minutes to talk to each other. If they don't take up that much time, we'll switch to Q&A, but then we'll take some questions from the audience after that. Okay, so feel free to comment in the chat window. And Mark and Lionel, the floor is yours to raise some questions and points of agreement and disagreement.
Thanks very much, Maggie. Lionel, I don't know if you want to start by saying something in response to what I've just said, or would you like me to get going?
No, maybe I can do that. Yeah, absolutely, because you just presented your ideas, and I think it's very stimulating because, as many people can understand, I think there are a lot of things that for which we can find convergences or stimulating, and some things also maybe some points of a much stronger discussion, and that's the interesting part. So when I was listening to you, it was very interesting and very clear, and thank you for your construction still, David Chalmers' argument, etc., on the difficult question of consciousness. So I could isolate a few chapters, and we decide together the one you would like to go in because we won't have time to address all of them. First, I think that my point on the David Chalmers' difficult question of consciousness, I like very much, the way Daniel Dennett, for instance, is addressing it. Of course, I think no one has a solution to the complex, difficult question, but at least you can say something, is that there can be some confusions. In particular, the fact that a material system can have immaterial properties is not a complex. It's not necessarily a complex problem. Dennett proposes, for instance, that when you have an object, a physical object with a mass, with a surface, a volume, etc., you can define a center of, for instance, a center of gravity to this object. And if you pay attention, center of gravity, it's a mathematical point. There is no length, no surface, no volume, no mass. So it's not matter, it's a mathematical point. So just to say, the fact that a physical system, a material system can be assigned with immaterial properties, in itself, it's not necessarily a drama or something very complex to explain. So just for the beginning, the first point, I don't know what is your reaction on that, Mark. And my first question to you would be, first, I think that there was a definition of consciousness because, of course, the anencephalic children you showed us, an anencephalic child you showed us, of course, the issue of is this child conscious or not? So for me, you went a little bit too fast by saying, oh, so okay, she is conscious. I don't know if she is conscious. It depends on the definition you want to keep. So for me, where I share a lot of things with you, is that, of course, a cortex by itself alone in a garage will not be conscious. So a cortex needs to be in a body, and cease to have interaction with the social environment. We know that, for instance, while children, if they are not socialized, they will not acquire language abilities, even if they have cortical networks with potentiality, etc. So I think the same could apply to consciousness. We need to isolate the prerequisites, like you said, the prerequisite. But for me, a prerequisite is a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. So I would say, for instance, of course, feelings, and in the Damasio mode, the unconscious emotions as opposed to the conscious feelings, for instance. So you have a layer, and the brainstem and the body is absolutely tremendous for me, also as for you. But I would not say that this level in itself is already related to conscious experience in the way I propose to define it. But that's a key question. So for me, it's a necessary condition, but not sufficient. But I fully agree that you need a body and you need a brainstem. And the illustration you gave are very impressive. And I know several of them, like the case of another case at the Salpêtrière with this patient with acute depression, which was, I knew the colleagues who explored her, etc. So that's one point. And the third point, just to give you the floor, is one question for us is, what is the minimal size of a workspace in the brain? So, for instance, we began to explore, patients with hemispherotomy. So I discovered that recently. Everyone knows callosotomy, in which you disconnect the two hemispheres, but some neurosurgeons for epileptic encephalopathy, severe ones, they can disconnect one hemisphere, the pathological hemisphere, from the other one, but at the same time, they disconnect it from the thalamus. And so we began to explore such children, and apparently, according to our cortical activity signatures of consciousness, this cortical network without thalamus does look like a vegetative state, not like a conscious mode of processing. We just had one case report and we are exploring this case. So it would be my third question. What is the minimal size of a workspace? So I think you need brainstem. You don't need two hemispheres, only one seems enough, etc. But it's an open question, open to clinical and experimental inquiry, yes. So that just for the introduction of my reaction to your ideas, which I think are very interesting. But so first, the David Chalmers problem, which may be not a so complex problem. Second, the fact that some of your necessary conditions may not be sufficient. So they are necessary, but they may not be sufficient. So like for the anencephalic or the feelings. And third, the minimal size of a workspace that we don't know yet, of course.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Lionel. So the matter of Chalmers, I certainly am on the same page as you and Dan Dennett when I locate myself on a physicalist ground. I do not think that consciousness is some fundamental property of the universe that cannot be accounted for in terms of known physics. In fact, the mere fact that the Big Bang preceded the emergence of life, all the laws of physics were there even before life emerged. Then with the emergence of life, that precedes by a long shot the emergence of consciousness. So even basic biological systems exist without consciousness. Clearly, therefore, consciousness must be constituted from these laws of physics and laws of biological self-organization that precede the dawn of consciousness. The alternative view, which Chalmers champions, is that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe that has to be added to our basic physics. Therefore, it was there at the time of or shortly after, at least the time of the Big Bang. That sounds unhelpfully like the idea of God to me. So we're on the same page when we say we have to find a functional mechanistic account. However, I do think that he has a point, and Frank Jackson before him, when they say that these mechanisms that we have been traditionally focusing on, namely the cortical cognitive mechanisms, underpinning things like the global accessibility, which is the core feature of the neuronal global workspace model, that there's no obvious reason why this function requires consciousness. And I do think that's an important point. It's not saying, it's not Dan Dennett's point. I absolutely agree with that. And you, it's more, we need a more specific, some functional mechanism which requires something it is like to instantiate that mechanism. And it's there that I'm saying that feeling has an advantage over cognition. So that's to the first point. To the second point, which I think is our major potential point of disagreement, is how we define consciousness. I think it's not, although it's, from an empirical point of view, it's perfectly reasonable to say, for the most part, that we mean self-reportability. But it's a bit like with the behaviorists, and I don't mean to equate you with behaviorists, but it's a bit like the problem with the behaviorists where they say, we're only going to study behavior. And then they slip into implying that all there is behavior, going from methodology to epistemology or ontology. You know, I think that it's perfectly reasonable to say we're going to use as a methodological device reportability. We mustn't imply ontologically that consciousness is reportability. If it were, there would be no such thing as conscious babies. There would be no such thing as conscious animals, and there would be no such thing as conscious hydranencephalic children. You know, I think that there's good reason to believe that animals and preverbal children and decorticate animals and decorticate children, that they at least experience feelings. It's because, as I said, it's not only a matter of observing their behavior. We use these other multiple lines of converging evidence, which also suggest that feeling is actually generated in the brainstem. We add that to the hydranencephalic kids, and it suggests you don't need cortex at all for raw feeling. But that leads to your third and final point about what is the minimal requirement for a global workspace. I will just say that a child with no cortex or an animal with no cortex does not have a global workspace. And therefore, they lose all the functionality that you are talking of, everything that is provided by that global workspace. So I need to emphasize very strongly that I'm not claiming that affect is a sufficient condition for cognitive consciousness, but I am saying it's a sufficient condition for the most basic form of consciousness, which enables you only to feel your way, this is better, this is worse, and to make choices without any necessary learning from it or reflection upon it. And I think that we would be taking our field a step forwards if we allowed ourselves to consider that rudimentary affective state to also qualify as consciousness. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. And Maggie, can we go on with the discussion? Yes. Or...
Oh yeah, no. You and Mark have 14 minutes left together. Okay,
because yes, it's a very nice discussion because also it's very clear what we say. So also for everyone listening to, we can see which are the points. So first, it's very, I think, not important because everyone thinks what he wants. I'm not a guru, but I like the fact that you also share this notion that we do not need to call for a special essence of consciousness. But we can discuss that. And when I say that, I don't say that I want to qualify the people. It's not a heretic or inquisition. Just so we share this view, and I think we can discuss about that. Second, I think for me, you see, for instance, what interests me the most in consciousness is really this what I develop this notion of fictions, interpretations, belief. So all the richness of your subjective experience, the one you can self-report. And of course, when you try to, when I say you, it's not you, Mark, but when some people try to enlarge the scope of consciousness, primarily they do so very often, very sincerely, by trying to grasp the very fundamental aspect of consciousness. But at the same time, for me, I discover that in many occasions, they lose the psychological subjectivity aspect of consciousness. And so you end up in something that you are very difficult to define from a subjective point of view. So it's like a poison kiss for me, in which you want to enlarge the field of consciousness. But in the end, what you define consciousness, there is nothing like a subjective experience anymore, because you can disqualify self-report. When I say you, it's not you again. It's so, for instance, the discussion we have with NetBlock, with an American philosopher, a very very expert in consciousness, cognitive neuroscience of consciousness, and a great philosopher. The NetBlock distinction between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. Access would relate to self-report, let's say, and phenomenal would be something beyond. And of course, one thing that I would like to discuss also with you is that for me, there is something like a slippery slope. Like when people want to go beyond self-report, there is this slippery slope of panpsychism. In the end, everything is conscious, because you can ask, for instance, so the key idea for some of you who are not familiar with NetBlock view is that we could call, so self-report is conscious for everyone, there is a consensus, but you could have conscious contents which escape your self-report. But if it is the case, you can ask NetBlock or his colleagues to say, how do you make the distinction between conscious, unreported, but phenomenal, from unconscious? And in the end, there is no strong argument, because if you say, because I can self-report, so your P consciousness is just report. And if you don't, you really want to make a space for this, let's say, non-reported conscious experience, you cannot distinguish it from unconscious. So in the end, everything is conscious. And so, and this is problematic. So one question for me would be, would you consider, because I think for me that feeling is mandatory for conscious emergence, so for the emergence of consciousness, but not sufficient. So would you say, for instance, that a feeling requires a nervous system? You know, in the last two books of Damasio, for instance, he tries to follow the biological development of homeostasis, regulation of homeostasis in bacteria, in viruses, etc., in parallel to the late emergence of nervous system. So would you say, for instance, Mark, that for you, a feeling requires a nervous system, or would you say that a bacteria reacting to a drop of acid would have a primary feeling and a primary consciousness? And before you answer, just the last thing, one thing which is also for me very stimulating also for the audience, of course, self-report is not restricted to what we do now. So it's not adult, educated, healthy people trying to share. So we can probe self-report beyond language. So you can probe self-report in patients, in many patients, in young, very young infants, so in babies, and of course, even in non-human animals. There is fantastic studies in primates, in non-human primates, in which you can collect subjective report of visual experience of monkeys without using a language code, for instance. So just to say that I share completely with you the fact that self-report is not restricted to educated language exchange. So you can have self-reports, which are going beyond our standard self-reports. So that's another question, meaning that the content of a workspace depends on the abilities of the constituents of this workspace. But just to re-react to your so do you need a nervous system for a feeling, for instance?
Well, as you broaden your definition of self-report, so I become increasingly reassured, because for me that's the crucial thing, is that we must not, like the behaviorists did, rule out of court ontologically something on purely methodological grounds. However, the problem of other minds is an enormous problem, and I think that we are always going to have to, it's always going to be a matter of inference. In fact, even you and I having this conversation, we both have to infer that each other have conscious states. So it's not enough to just have behavioral criteria, and I'm very relieved to hear you saying that. I think that the question then becomes, well, where do we go beyond the behavioral criteria? And I start with the observation as to what obliterates consciousness in humans. As you well know, small upper brainstem lesions obliterate consciousness entirely. And it's not only that they obliterate it entirely in humans, also in every other animal in which you make the same lesions, you produce coma. Now we come to the mechanism, the affective mechanism that I spoke of. We can start to make predictions. When you stimulate certain structures in the human who can report, they report intense affective states of a pleasurable or unpleasurable kind. We can make predictions as to what sort of behavior we expect from another creature, whether it be a human being or a non-human animal. And if those predictions are confirmed, then I think that by the ordinary rules of science, we have good grounds for inferring that there is affective consciousness, the raw form of consciousness, the foundational form that I'm referring to. And as you well know, once we get beyond vertebrates, the structures are no longer there that produce consciousness in ourselves, that basic form that I'm speaking of. And so I start to become very uncomfortable when we attribute consciousness to any creature that doesn't have the machinery that does it in us. At that point, I see you nodding, and so I'm glad we're in agreement. Now I'll probably say something that you will disagree with, and I'm sad to have to do that because it's nice to be friends. But I think the same applies then in reverse. If we then believe, okay, so the basic mechanism of consciousness is this extended form of homeostasis, the most basic kind, then I think we should be able to, if we truly have found the causal mechanism of raw feeling, then we should be able to engineer that. Like Richard Feynman said, if I can't create it, I don't understand it. So for me, that's really the answering of the hard problem of Chalmers, that the ultimate answer to that problem would require us to artificially engineer an artificial form of simple consciousness, which would then make predictions that it should be able to make choices in uncertain and novel situations that sustain its own survival. In other words, the keeping going of the system and so on. What do you think about that, Lionel, that last point? Because it seems we agree on the other points.
No, so there is nothing shocking for me what you said. So no, I think it's a very stimulating question. In addition to the ethical aspect also related to it. For me, a way to answer to this point is that so I think that these primary mechanisms of affect, I think they are mandatory for emergence of consciousness. But I think that by themselves, they do not satisfy the criterion I would require to call that conscious. So I would not make a distinction between conscious affective from conscious cognitive. I think cognitive consciousness is always affective also. So the point where I want to go is that I think that you need this brainstem or bodily mediated mechanism to build at your cortex level a self-representation. What does it mean to be you? And I think that for the emergence of this kind of representation, so I would propose, I don't know, it's only speculation, but I would not be surprised if we could turn to show that you have critical periods in development during which the interplay between the body and the cortex and all those, I mean, let's say the brain and all other organs of the body are absolutely mandatory for the build-up of the self-representation. Maybe it's in utero or I don't know. But once you have it, and that could be a point where we disagree, of course, it's much better if you can still have a brain-body communication, of course. But if it's not the case, I think once you could have the development of the self-representation in your mind and in your brain, then this affective life, of course, is very important, but would not be as mandatory for you to be conscious. A little bit like for language. If you don't have social interactions for language acquisition, you will not have access to language. But when you have it, you can stay alone and speak to yourself for years, and for your life you can write what you. So and the same for, I think, for these body-brain interactions. And as you know, in many patients, so you have patients with deafferentations. And 2 years ago with Benjamin Rowe, we could see a patient who, after several strokes, not only had a traditional locked-in syndrome patient, but he was completely blind, he was deaf, he was differentiated not only from the motor system, but also for the sensory modalities. So he was like a brain in a vat, you see, but he was an adult, and we could, so he went through this critical period, and we could demonstrate that the patient was conscious, and then he could recover a minimal code to communicate with us later on. So I think for the emergence in your cortical networks of this specific representation being you as being yourself a conscious agent, you need embodiment. But once you have it, maybe you don't need it anymore. When you dream or when you have a fantasy, you don't need to run or to actually do exactly what you imagine to let these representations occur. So I would say that. And so I would respond by introducing this proposal of critical periods in which affective life would play a much more important causal role. And by saying that, sorry, we are going very fast. I'm not saying that by saying after you are completely cognitive, disconnected from emotion, it's not what I say. I just say that to be conscious, you need this build-up, which requires your body and your affects. But once you have it, like all your other representation, you can play with them and they circulate in the flux of your brain, and you don't really need causally such an initial mechanism. But that's speculation.
Well, I'm sure Maggie wants us to go to the audience
Yes,
now, so I'll
Mark,
you
have 2 minutes. Great.
I'll keep myself to those 2 minutes. I'll end just with this. I've enjoyed very much our conversation.
Yeah, me too.
I would like you to consider the possibility that the global workspace, because you've spoken now of it being possible for it, at least in principle, to become detached from the context that originally gave rise to this functionality. I think it's possible that the actual ignition and the sustaining of the salient connectivity, which is so central to your theory, I think that it's driven by upper brainstem mechanisms. Those are not cortico-cortical. That cortico-cortical connectivity is unsustainable by purely cortical neurotransmission. I think that it is the upper brainstem neuromodulation that creates that ignition and sustains that reverberation. And so I think in principle, that is a necessary part of the global workspace. But of course, it doesn't do the actual work that the global workspace is doing. I would like you to entertain that possibility. It would make us psychoanalysts very happy because it would mean
if you say
cognition
necessary,
is driven.
Yeah, if you say necessary but not sufficient, maybe we can have a deal. We'll see. But you know, and by the same time, you know, in my book, The New Unconscious, my first reaction was to say, I have to do the work by myself alone, the one I can do, because what is sometimes frustrating me a lot is when you have this kind of not with you, that's the reason why I enjoy it, but you have discussion between shrinks and biologists. Either it's a completely what we call a dialogue de sourds, so there is no convergence, and the other one is like the great mess. You want to be friends, so you find ways to find the solutions even beyond the rationality. So I think you just have to. So we can be friends even if we disagree on some points. It's not. I would say that the only condition for being friends actually, not to be in a fusion. So just to remain in a Cajal mode, not in a Golgi mode. I would say yes.
Agreed.
So that's a nice note to switch to the Q&A. So we have many more questions in the chat than we'll have time for in this session. So we'll be able to share the questions with Mark and Lionel in case they want to address some of them in writing, and then we can send them out to the participants. So that's a possibility. So let's just see if we can get a lot in by having succinct questions and succinct answers. So first up is Yoella, then Alexi, and then Andrea Clarici. So Yoella, go ahead.
You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my question is about negative priming. Yeah, and because I heard Lionel saying about about priming, and I just wonder what happens. I hear
Yoella. Sorry, Yoella.
I hear something.
Joella, do you have another device in your house that's also in the meeting?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's
Yeah, I mean, I have a friend with the device. When you do negative priming, for people who, it is let's say, a Stroop test where you have the number, the word green written in red, and the next, there is a predictor that the other word will be red written in another color. So there is a prediction, and the prediction is seen very fast by people with schizophrenia, and not seen in normals. You can check the reaction times. Do you have any explanation?
Yes, thank you, Joella, for your question. So there is a
Sorry,
plenty.
excuse
Yes.
me. Sorry, Joella, can you please mute now so we won't have the echo?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So on priming, we are many works are used in priming as you described. So the Stroop test or other tests, and so there are several things. Just so to refer to your question, the difference between the schizophrenic patients and the healthy subjects. One group being able to access consciously to the predictability, if I understood you well, whereas the other group could not. I cannot really elaborate. You can send me the study, but for instance, in schizophrenic patients, on priming studies, a lot of colleagues could demonstrate, for instance, that you have hypersemantic, so you have hyperpriming effects in some schizophrenic subjects. So meaning that when you present a word, you can have access to a lot of semantic neighbors with the dynamics and the structure which is not exactly the same as in healthy participants, as if some part of the schizophrenic language and discourse jumping to others from one subject to the other one, making links between things it seems that you can have a psychological basis to it. I think Manfred Spitzer, Marcus Kiefer worked a lot on this aspect in schizophrenic. And just for the aspect of priming, what is really interesting, for instance, Phil Miracle and other people, if you use the Stroop, but with an unconscious presentation in which most of the trials are incongruent. So when the word is green, it will be printed in red, or in red, it will be in green. If you do that consciously, so you can be aware of the fact that most of the trials are incongruent, you can elaborate a new strategy to take advantage of the incongruence and to be better in the incongruent trials, because you split the information between the cue stimulus and the target stimulus. But when you do the same thing by masking the cue stimulus, you cannot elaborate this new strategy. It's one of the key situations in which you see that when you are consciously processing information, you can invent new strategies to overcome regularities, but you cannot do that in many situations, but when it's not accessible to your conscious access. But you should have a look to the papers of Manfred Spitzer and Marcus Kiefer.
Thank you. So the next question is from Alexei Tolchinsky.
Hi, I had a question for Lionel. In the advanced stages of dementia, the modularity of the mind seems to increase. There's loss of cohesion, synthesis, and integration. Would you say that massive damage to the prefrontal and parietal areas in the cortex negatively impacts the global workspace network in advanced dementia? Because I'm not sure of that. I've met patients with progressed dementia who could hum a tune accurately, and so I'm curious what you think about that.
Thank you, Alexei. That's a great question. And also as a neurologist, once a week I see patients, and my consultation is mostly oriented on cognitive neuropsychology, neurology. So I have but let's say 1/3 of the patients are affected with neurodegenerative disorders, Lewy body or Alzheimer's or frontotemporal or whatever, or vascular, etc. And it's true that the more you advance in the various dementia, the more the issue of consciousness is really a question. And I share the same observation as you. And the other population of patients that I do examine are the non-communicating patients. So we could not discuss too much today, but it's another fascinating subject for ethical, clinical, but also scientific aspects. The minimally conscious versus the vegetative state patients, etc. So in some case of very severe demented patients, I end up with the same clinical scales. as the one I'm using for the non-communicating patient, like the CRS, the coma recovery scale from Giacino and colleagues. So just to say that, of course, we see this fragmentation, the dissolution of the workspace. And actually, in many dementia, you see some impairment on some conscious abilities. Even, for instance, you know, there's notion of in Alzheimer's disease, even when the subjects are completely conscious, but there is this lack of self-projection. And that, you know, there is this great set of work showing that the episodic memory problem of the Alzheimer's disease patient is not related to mental traveling to the past exclusively, but mental traveling to the future. So projection, etc. Patients there is a nice PNAS paper a few years ago about that, and many other studies since then, showing that these patients do have difficulties in let's say, escaping from the ici et maintenant, from the here and now. So they cannot project as easily in time, in space, in the mind of the other people. So I share with you the fact that exploration of consciousness and unconscious processing in demented patients is very important. The last one is that the placebo effect seems to decrease, as if you cannot project anymore in beliefs, in more sophisticated beliefs. So it has to be confirmed, but I saw two papers showing that there is some evidence showing that the placebo effect decreases, for instance, in Alzheimer's disease, as if to be able to engage in this kind of fictionalization, of conscious fictionalization, you need some brain apparatus that is lacking here. So thank you, that's a great area of work, yes.
Thank you. Next question from Andrea Clarici. If Andrea is not with us at the moment, we'll go to Ken Gross.
Yes, this would be for Mark. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Solms, when you think about infants who develop a social smile, recognize their mother, do you see that as a pre-conscious state, or could that be a kind of reflexive emotionality that might be separate from consciousness? I mean, obviously there's no quote unquote cognitive consciousness there. So what is your thought about the emotion related to smiling and as it relates to meeting new individuals who they encounter, in particular their mother?
I think we face all of the methodological and epistemological problems that Lionel and I were talking about earlier. And I won't simply recapitulate what I said there about different methodological strategies. I'll rather make a theoretical point, Ken, which is that, first of all, it is certainly, I think, entirely reasonable to acknowledge that there are reflexive and instinctual behaviors which have no affect behind them. They are simply unconscious, involuntary reflexes and instinctual responses. For me, the crucial thing is that if we're going to transcend reflex and instinct, then in other words, if we're going to make it up as we're going along and improve on the predictions that we are born with, which is what reflexes and instincts are, then we need to navigate uncertainty. And that's when feeling comes into its own. So the reason why feeling is attached to instinctual behaviors is because they are not enough. It's because we are needing to go beyond what is inborn. And feeling seems to me to be pivotal to doing that, to navigating uncertainty. And I think this applies at the higher cognitive levels too, like in the questions that Lionel was just responding to in both of those. In the dementing patient, the loss of adaptability, the loss of cognitive flexibility, the loss of them being able to think on their feet, and the experimental studies that he was referring to. What the consciousness adds is the ability to override what is overlearned and stereotyped, and to make things up as you're going along, which is no small thing. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. So just so we can stay roughly on time, we'll just take two last questions, and if from Sherry and Elia. So if Sherry, so okay, so Andrea, if you just dropped out for a second, yeah. So Andrea, Sherry, and Elia can each state their brief questions, and then we'll see if we can get very brief responses from the speakers. Go ahead, Andrea.
Thank you. Great talk from both. Just to be succinct, Mark, since it's just a real fundamental mechanism, that is homeostasis, what happens on the other side of the settling point, in your opinion, if that is in the thermostat metaphor? If you go not through the hotness of an emotion, but you go towards the coldness on the left side of the settling point, what happens?
Thank you, Andrea. So we'll take Sherry's question and then Elia's question, and then brief responses.
My question was just for Lionel. I'm just wondering how that masked unmasked paradigm might map onto when you're working with a patient who has defense mechanisms, and you kind of have to get underneath that to pull stuff into the unconscious. How does that? Is that kind of the same idea?
Great question. And Elia, you get the last question.
Thank you.
Elia, try one more time.
Just a second. Let's try to do it this way.
I'm sorry, Elia. Yeah, you have a lot of
no,
echo.
it's okay. No, I don't have an echo. One of the things I'm not always clear, this is a question mainly to Mark Solms. You keep saying that feelings are conscious. I work a lot with highly traumatized individuals that are highly alexithemic, and many times cannot report what they feel, not even on the level of basic feeling homeostasis of pleasant and unpleasant. They just don't know. Yes, but still there will be a move. They will move into action because of those emotions that are absolutely unconscious for them, from my perspective and from their perspective. But you say all the time that feelings are conscious. That for me is contradicting with my clinical experience.
So Lionel, perhaps you want to answer Sherry, and then I'll answer those for me.
Yes, thank you, and I will be very brief. So thank you very much, Sherry. Yes, that's a key question also for practice. I will just send you and share with all participants a PNAS paper that we published a few years ago with Raphaël Gaillard, Antoine Delcule, and Stanislas. So we use the priming paradigm in a let's say a little bit complex mode, but basically the key idea was to explore if the emotional valence of words was modulating your conscious access to this word. So we could present the words with the words being either strongly masked or poorly masked, lightly masked, and in between. So to study the curve of your conscious access, the dynamic access, to see at what point how masked the word need to be or unmasked for you to be able to access half of the word. And we controlled a lot of things, not for paying attention to the emotional valence, etc. And in particular, what we discovered was that actually, when the words are not consciously perceived, it decreases the requirements of masking for you to be able to access them. So the more a word was fearful, the easier it was for subjects to consciously access to it. And of course, we played with this idea that, for instance, the unconscious defense. So to play the game, I'm sorry to be very brief, but the unconscious naive view in some readers of Freud saying, okay, there is this Mr. Unconscious preventing you to access because it's a problem, whatever. Actually, we see the contrary. When the words were super fearful and super negative for the individual, they were easier to consciously perceive. So we discussed this point, and it's not only the single result, but one of the reasons why also I propose this notion that I think psychoanalysis is fantastic to explore consciousness rather than unconscious aspect, but it would require a longer discussion to that if you want one day with pleasure. But So, but I will send you the paper at least. I can copy the link in the discussion, for instance.
I can't resist making the observation that what Lionel's just reported is exactly what my own view would have predicted. My answers to the two questions directed to me, the one by Andrea, namely, he was saying with a homeostatic settling point being here, if a deviation this way is unpleasant and a deviation and a return to the settling point this way is pleasant, what happens if you go to that side? And this is just a illustrative device, the way that I picture it. So you could easily do it. There are undershoots and there are overshoots. They're both unpleasant. So just take temperature. Getting too hot is a deviation from where you need to be. Getting too cold is a deviation from where you need to be. They're both unpleasant. I just picture them for illustrative purposes, both on the same side, so that it's simple. But of course, it's the same principle. Deviation is bad, no matter which direction, and a return to the settling point is good. And the affects concerned work accordingly. So no longer being too cold feels good, and no longer being too hot feels good. The question about alexithymia, it cuts to the heart of the problem of reportability. It's why I'm so uneasy with reportability being the sole criterion or reified criterion for determining what it is like, determining the presence of the actual raw feeling. Defenses, of course, they exist. And defenses against what you're feeling affects what you report you're feeling. And I will leave my answer at that because of the shortness of time, only adding this observation that you say, I keep saying that feelings are conscious by definition. I need to remind you that it was Freud who said that. I'm just agreeing with Freud and providing new evidence to show that he was probably right, because the mechanism of feeling in the brain is the mechanism of consciousness in the brain. It's the sort of the foundational arousal mechanisms are the same mechanisms as generate feeling. I would be very happy, Maggie, if you send us the questions that are in the chat to address as many as I can in writing in the next couple of days and send them back to you. Thank you all very much. And thank you so much, Lionel. This dialogue was everything I hoped it would be.
Yes, me too. Me too. Thank you very much. It was great. Yes, and thank you, Maggie, and all the participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you both, everybody. So just a couple of quick notes. So first of all, just for those of you, I could predict that 80% of the group right now is just like, wait, I wanted to hear, what do I, and it's like, yep, that's exactly what a neuropsychoanalysis conference is supposed to feel like. Just like huge ideas. Oh my God, I have to follow up on this. How does this connect? That's all good. It's all normal. So there's plenty of time to follow up in various ways. So now just a few housekeeping things. So I will make just some brief announcements, and then we'll take a 10-minute break or thereabouts. We'll come back at 1:15. So we're only 5 minutes late, which is fantastic. The next session is going to be 3 brief presentations from clinicians who have been working in supervision with Mark. That's going to be great. If you want CPDs, you can send me a private chat with your full name and then the letters CPD. If you did already pay the fee, you're all set. If you didn't pay the fee yet, we'll send you the information, or you can find the link in the chat of where to pay the fee. And I think that's about it for now. We'll say more later, but let's go take a break. Let your mind rest. You can post some more comments in the chat to everyone, and we'll come back at 1:15, our time, 1:15. Thank you, everybody.